From New York, this is Democracy Now!
Democracy has been broken, and our first vote is happening in 28 days, and nothing has changed. No election laws have changed. Facebook's a crime scene. No research, nothing has come out.
The Great Hack. We continue our look at the shadowy data firm Cambridge Analytica and its attempt to use Facebook to sway elections across the world, from Trump's election in 2016 to Brexit. We speak with the directors of the Oscar shortlisted documentary, The Great Hack, as well as a propaganda researcher and Cambridge Analytica whistleblower Brittany Kaiser, author of Targeted, the Cambridge Analytica whistleblower's inside story of how big data, Trump, and Facebook broke democracy and how it can happen again.
I should be very concerned, and everyone should be very concerned about the weaponization of our data by people that are actually experts in selling weapons.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The House of Representatives has voted to approve a non-binding war powers resolution aimed at limiting President Trump's ability to take further military action against Iran without congressional approval. President Trump ratcheted up tensions with Iran by assassinating Iranian commander Qasem Soleimani in a targeted drone strike at the Baghdad International Airport last week. Thursday's 224 to 194 House vote included 3 Republicans voting yes and 8 Democrats voting no. The resolution now heads to the Senate. The vote came as Iran's ambassador to the United Nations blasted the U.S. at the UN Security Council, speaking on behalf of Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif, who was unable to address the Security Council himself after the U.S. denied him a visa in violation of a 1947 U.S.-UN agreement. This is Ambassador Majid Takhtravanchi.
I'm here today to deliver a statement on behalf of His Excellency Mr. Zarif, whose visa was denied by the United States in contravention of the headquarters agreement. And here is his statement. We are meeting today to discuss a momentous imperative we are all confronted with. The world is at a crossroads. With the end of monopolies on power, one unhinged regime is frantically clamoring to turn back time.
Thousands gathered in Chicago, New York, Seattle, and dozens of other cities to protest war with Iran Thursday night. The New York Times has obtained video that appears to show an Iranian missile hitting the Boeing 737 jet that crashed shortly after takeoff in Tehran Wednesday, killing all 176 people on board. The crash came hours after Iran fired ballistic missiles at 2 Iraqi military bases, which housed Iraqi and U.S. troops in retaliation for General Soleimani's assassination. This is Canadian Foreign Minister François-Philippe Champagne.
We have intelligence from multiple sources, including our allies and our own intelligence, that indicates that the plane was shot down by an Iranian surface-to-air missile. This may well have been unintentional.
Iranian officials have denied allegations they mistakenly shot down the passenger jet that was headed to Kiev, Ukraine. The inquiry into the plane crash in Tehran comes as the jet's manufacturer, Boeing, is facing even more scrutiny over its troubled 737 MAX jet. As released, internal emails show Boeing employees talking about deceiving federal regulators and joking about potential safety flaws in the plane's design ahead of the 2 fatal plane crashes that killed all 346 people on board in Indonesia and Ethiopia. In one email, an employee wrote, quote, "This airplane is designed by clowns who are in turn supervised by monkeys," unquote. In another, an employee asked a colleague, quote, "Would you put your family on a MAX simulator-trained aircraft? I wouldn't," unquote. In a third, a worker wrote in apparent reference to interactions with the FAA, quote, "I still haven't been forgiven by God for the covering up I did last year," unquote. The Boeing 737 MAX has been grounded worldwide. President Trump's proposing changing the nation's oldest environmental law to exempt large infrastructure projects such as pipelines and power plants from environmental review. If enacted, the changes would exempt agencies from considering the cumulative environmental impacts of projects, which could include studying the climate crisis. In immigration news, a Mexican asylum seeker died by suicide Wednesday when he slit his own throat after being denied entry into the United States at the Far Reynosa International Bridge at the Texas-Mexico border. Meanwhile, in Louisiana, 2 asylum seekers from India are reportedly on the brink of death as their hunger strike against their prolonged detention stretches into its 69th day. Medical staff at the LaSalle ICE immigration jail are force hydrating the 2 men. And in Arizona, the chief of the Tohono O'odham Nation says the construction of the border wall on the nation's land may have unearthed ancient human remains inside the Organ Pipe Cactus National Monument in the Sonoran Desert. In election news, 6 presidential candidates, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, Pete Buttigieg, Amy Klobuchar, Joe Biden, and Tom Steyer, will take to the stage for the final Democratic debate before the Iowa caucus. It will happen in Des Moines next Tuesday. All the candidates on stage will be white after New Jersey Senator Cory Booker and entrepreneur Andrew Yang did not qualify for the debate. Billionaire Tom Steyer qualified after pouring more than $115 million of his own money into his campaign. Billionaire former New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg did not qualify for the debate, despite spending nearly $170 million of his own money on ads. In France, at least 500,000 people flooded the streets across the country Thursday to show their support for the unionized rail workers whose strike against French President Emmanuel Macron's attempted pension overhaul has now become the longest transportation strike in French history. This is Yuli Yamamoto.
Edouard Philippe dares to say that women are the great winners of the reform. That's not true and awful. He knows that women are the biggest losers from the reform. Why? Because he knows that they have different jobs, have to take more care of children, work part-time. So for sure they have careers with gaps, shorter careers. So if you take the whole career into account, women will be hit the hardest.
In the United States, Health and Human Services Secretary Alex Azar has declared a public health emergency for Puerto Rico after a 6.4 magnitude earthquake rocked the island early Tuesday, killing at least 1 person and plunging nearly the entire population into darkness. As of Thursday, electrical power was restored to about half of residents. The Puerto Rico Electric Energy Agency says its goal is to restore power for all residents by this weekend. In New York, a grand jury indicted the suspect in the Hanukkah attack for 5 more federal hate crimes Thursday. Grafton Thomas allegedly stabbed at least 5 Jewish worshippers who were celebrating Hanukkah at a rabbi's house in Muncie, New York last month. His lawyers say he's mentally ill. A new study suggests that raising the minimum wage by $1 an hour could save thousands of lives of people from dying by suicide each year, and that if the minimum wage had been at least $2 an hour higher, nearly 60,000 lives could have been saved between 1990 and 2015. Suicide is now the 2nd leading cause of death in the United States among children and youth ages 10 to 24, with the suicide rate among black youth rising faster than any other racial group. And in Texas, Yolanda Carr has died. She was the mother of Tatiana Jefferson, the African-American woman who was killed by a white police officer in October. Carr had been fighting illness at the time of her daughter's death, and Tatiana Jefferson, known to the family as Tay, had been her caretaker. Former Fort Worth police officer Aaron Dean shot Jefferson through her bedroom window while responding to a non-emergency wellness check called for by a neighbor who saw Tay's front door had been left open. The officer never identified himself as a police officer. Tatiana's father also died in November of a heart attack less than 1 month after his daughter's death. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. A longtime Facebook executive has admitted the company's platform helped Donald Trump win the 2016 election and predicted it may happen again this year. In an internal memo, Facebook Vice President Andrew Bosworth wrote, was Facebook responsible for Donald Trump getting elected? I think the answer is yes, he said. Bosworth, who was a backer of Hillary Clinton in 2016, went on to write that the company should not change its policies in an effort to hurt Trump's re-election chances. Bosworth credited Trump for running, quote, the single best digital ad campaign I've ever seen from any advertiser. In his memo, Bosworth referenced the role of the shadowy data firm Cambridge Analytica, but downplayed its significance. However, a new Netflix documentary called The Great Hack argues Cambridge Analytica has played a critical role in the U.S. election as well as elections across the globe. Cambridge Analytica was founded by the right-wing billionaire Robert Mercer. Trump's former advisor, Steve Bannon, was the company's vice president and claims to have named the company. Cambridge Analytica harvested some 87 million Facebook profiles without the user's knowledge or consent and used the data to sway voters during the 2016 campaign. The story of Cambridge Analytica is featured in the new documentary, The Great Hack, which has been shortlisted for an Oscar.
All of your interactions, your credit card swipes, web searches, locations, likes, they're all collected in real time into a $1 trillion a year industry.
The real game changer was Cambridge Analytica.
They'd worked for the Trump campaign and for the Brexit campaign.
They started using information warfare.
Cambridge Analytica claimed to have 5,000 data points on every American voter.
Well, earlier this week, I spoke to the directors of The Great Hack, Jahan Nujaim and Kareem Amr, as well as propaganda researcher Emma Bryant and a former employee at Cambridge Analytica, Brittany Kaiser, who has begun posting online a trove of documents detailing the company's operations, including its work with President Trump's former national security advisor, John Bolton. Kaiser has also written about her experience at the company in the book Targeted, the Cambridge Analytica whistleblower's inside story of how big data, Trump, and Facebook broke democracy and how it can happen again. Kaiser is one of two former Cambridge Analytica employees featured in The Great Hack. The other is Christopher Wiley.
It's incorrect to call Cambridge Analytica a purely sort of data science company or an algorithm, company. It is a full-service propaganda machine.
I asked Cambridge Analytica whistleblower Brittany Kaiser to talk about how she came to be involved with Cambridge Analytica.
I think it's very important to note this because there are people all around the world that are working for tech companies that I'm sure joined that company in order to do something good. They want the world to be more connected. They want to use technology in order to communicate with everybody, to get people more engaged in important issues. And they don't realize that while you're moving fast and breaking things, some things get so broken that you cannot actually contemplate or predict what those repercussions are going to look like. Chris Wiley and I both really idealistically joined Cambridge Analytica because we were excited about the potential of using data for exciting and good impact projects. Chris joined in 2013 on the data side in order to start developing different types of psychographic models. So he worked with Dr. Alexander Kogan and the Cambridge Psychometrics Center at Cambridge University in order to start doing experiments with Facebook data to be able to gather that data, which we now know was taken under the wrong auspices of academic research and was then used in order to identify people's psychographic groupings.
Now explain that, psychographic groupings, and especially for people who are not on Facebook, who don't understand its enormous power and the intimate knowledge it has of people. Think of someone you're talking to who's never experienced Facebook. Explain what is there.
Absolutely. So the amount of data that is collected about you on Facebook and on any of your devices is much more than you're really made aware of. You probably haven't ever read the terms and conditions of any of these apps on your phone. But if you actually took the time to do it and you could understand it, because most of them are written for you not to understand, that's written in legalese, you would realize that you are giving away a lot more than you would have ever agreed to if there was transparency. This is your every move, everywhere you're going, who you're talking to, who your contacts are, what information you're actually giving in other apps on your phone, your location data, all of your lifestyle, where you're going, what you're doing, what you're reading, how long you spend looking at different images and websites. This amount of behavioral data gives such a good picture of you that your behavior can be predicted, as Kareem was talking about earlier, to a very high degree of accuracy. And this allows companies like Cambridge Analytica to understand how you see the world and what will motivate you to go and take an action or, unfortunately, what will demotivate you. So that amount of data available on Facebook ever since you joined allows a very easy platform for you to be targeted and manipulated. And when I say psychographic targeting, I'm sure you probably are a little bit more familiar with the Myers-Briggs test. So the Myers-Briggs that asks you a set of questions in order to understand your personality and how you see the world. The system that Cambridge Analytica used is actually a lot more scientific. It's called the Ocean 5-factor model. And Ocean stands for O for openness, C for conscientiousness, whether you prefer plans in order or you're a little bit more fly by the seat of your pants, extroversion, whether you gather your energy from being out surrounded by people, or you're introverted and you prefer to gather your energy from being alone. If you are agreeable, you care about your family, your community, society, your country, more than you care about yourself. And if you are disagreeable, then you are a little bit more egotistical. You need messages that are about benefits to you. And then the worst is neurotic. You know, it's not bad to be neurotic. It means that you are a little bit more emotional. It means, unfortunately, as well, that you are motivated by fear-based messaging. So people can use tactics in order to scare you to doing what they want to do. And this is what was targeted when they were gathering that data out of Facebook to figure out which group you belonged into. They found about 32 different groups of people, different personality types. And there were groups of psychologists that were looking into how they could understand that data and convert that into messaging that was just for you. I need to remind everybody that the Trump campaign put together over 1 million different advertisements that were put out. 1 million different advertisements with tens of thousands of different campaigns. Some of these messages were for just you, were for 50 people, 100 people. Obviously, certain groups are thousands, tens of thousands, or millions, but some of them were targeted very much directly at the individual to know exactly what you're going to click on and exactly what you care about.
So they were doing this before Cambridge Analytica. But describe, I want to actually go to a Bannon clip, Steve Bannon, who takes credit for naming Cambridge Analytica, right? Because you had SCL before defense.
Yes.
And then it becomes Cambridge Analytica for Cambridge University, right? Where Kogan got this information that he culled from Facebook.
Yes.
This is the White House chief strategist, Steve Bannon. In an interview at a Financial Times conference in March 2018, Bannon said that reports that Cambridge Analytica improperly accessed data to build profiles on American voters and influence the 2016 presidential election were politically motivated. Months later, evidence emerged linking Bannon to Cambridge Analytica, the scandal, which resulted in a $5 billion fine for Facebook. Bannon's the founder and former board member of the political consulting firm. He's vice president of Cambridge Analytica.
All Cambridge Analytica is the data scientist and the applied applications here in the United States. It has nothing to do with the international stuff. The Guardian actually tells you that, and the Observer tell you that when you get down to the 10th paragraph, okay? When you get down to the 10th paragraph, and what Nix does overseas is what Nix does overseas, right? It was a data company. And by the way, Cruz's campaign and the Trump campaign say, hey, they were a pretty good data company, but this whole thing on psychographics was optionality in the deal. If it ever worked, it worked. But it hasn't worked, and it doesn't look like it's going to work. So it was never even applied.
So that's Steve Bannon in 2018, key to President Trump's victory and to his years so far in office before he was forced out. What was your relationship with Steve Bannon? You worked at Cambridge Analytica for over 3 years. You had the keys to the castle, is that right, in Washington?
Yes, for a while I actually split the keys to what is Steve's house with Alexander Nix because we used his house as our office. His house is also used as a Breitbart office in the basement. It's called the Breitbart Embassy on Capitol Hill. And that's where I would go for meetings. I believe it was owned by the Mercer family, that building. And we would come into the basement and use that boardroom for our meetings. And we would use that for planning who we were going to go pitch to, what campaigns we were going to work for, what advocacy groups, what conservative 501c3s and c4s he wanted us to go see. And I didn't spend a lot of time with Steve, but the time I did was incredibly insightful. Almost every time I saw him, he'd be showing me some new Hillary Clinton hit video that he had come out with, or announcing that he was about to throw a book launch party for Ann Coulter for Adios America, which was something that he invited both me and Alexander to, and we promptly decided to leave the house before she arrived. But Steve was very influential in the development of Cambridge Analytica and who we were going to go see, who we were going to support with our technology. And he made a lot of the introductions, which in the beginning seemed a little less nefarious than they did later on, when he got very confident and started introducing us to right-wing political parties across Europe and in other countries, and tried to get meetings with the main political parties or leftist or green parties instead, to make sure that those far right-wing parties that do not have the world's best interests at heart could not get access to these technologies.
You said in The Great Hack, in the film, that you have evidence of illegality of the Trump and Brexit campaigns, that they were conducted illegally. I was wondering if you can go into that. I mean, it was controversial even, and Carol Kalwalder, the great reporter at The Observer and The Guardian, was blasted and was personally targeted, very well demonstrated in The Great Hack, for saying that that Cambridge Analytica was involved in Brexit. They kept saying they had nothing to do with it until she shows a video of you, who worked for Cambridge Analytica, at one of the founding events of Leave It or Brexit.
Yeah, Leave.eu, that panel that I was on, which has now become quite an infamous video, was their launch event to launch the campaign. And Cambridge Analytica was in deep negotiations through introduction of Steve Bannon with both of the Brexit campaigns. I was told actually originally we pitched Remain, and the Remain side said that they did not need to spend money on expensive political consultants because they were going to win anyway. And that's actually what I also truly believed, and so did they. So Steve made the introductions to make sure that we would still get a commercial contract out of this political campaign, and both to Vote Leave and Leave EU. Cambridge Analytica took Leave EU, and AIQ, which was Cambridge Analytica's essentially digital partner before Cambridge Analytica could run our own digital campaigns. They were running the Vote Leave side, both funded by the Mercers, both with the same access to this giant database on American voters. Brexit? There was Cambridge Analytica work as well as AIQ work in both of the Leave campaigns. So a lot of that money, in order to collect that data and in order to build the infrastructure of both of those companies, came from Mercer-funded campaigns, yes.
And again, explain what AIQ is.
AIQ was a company that actually ran all of Cambridge Analytica's digital campaigns until January 2016, when Molly Schweikert, our head of digital, was hired in order to build ad tech internally within the company. AIQ was based in Canada and was a partner that had access to Cambridge Analytica data the entire time that they were running the Vote Leave campaign, which was the designated and main campaign in Brexit.
So when did you see the connection between Brexit and the Trump campaign?
Actually, a lot of it started to come when I saw some of Carol's reporting, because there were a lot of conspiracy theories over what was going on, and I didn't know what to believe. All I knew was that we definitely did work in the Brexit campaign. We, as in when I was at Cambridge Analytica, because I was one of the people working on the campaign. And we obviously played a large role in not just the Trump campaign itself, but Trump super PACs and a lot of other conservative advocacy groups, 501c3s, 4s, that were the infrastructure that allowed for the building of the movement that pushed Donald Trump into the White House.
I mean, it looks like Cambridge Analytica was heading to a billion-dollar corporation.
That's what Alexander used to tell us all the time. That was the carrot that he waved in front of our eyes in order to have us keep going. We're building a billion-dollar company. Aren't you excited? And I think that that's what so many people get caught up in. People that are currently working at Facebook, people that are working at Google, people that are working at companies where they are motivated to build exciting technology that obviously can also be very dangerous, but they think they're going to financially benefit and be able to take care of themselves and their families because of it.
So what was illegal?
The massive problems that came from the data collection specifically are where my original accusations come from, because data was collected under the auspices of being for academic research and was used for political and commercial purposes. There were also different data sets that are not supposed to be matched and used without explicit transparency and consent in the United Kingdom, because they actually have good national data protection laws and international data protection laws through the European Union to protect voters. Unfortunately, in the United States, we only have seen the state of California coming out and doing it. Now, on the other side, we have voter suppression laws that prevent our vote from being suppressed. We have laws against discrimination in advertising, racism, sexism, incitement of violence. All of those things are illegal, yet somehow a platform like Facebook has decided that if politicians want to use any of those tactics, that they will not be held to the same community standards as you or me or the basic laws and social contracts that we have in this country.
Cambridge Analytica whistleblower Brittany Kaiser. When we come back, we speak to the directors of The Great Hack, the documentary that's just been shortlisted for an Academy Award. Let Me Steal Your Secret soundtrack from the documentary The Great Hack. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman as we continue our look at Cambridge Analytica, Facebook, and their roles in the 2016 U.S. election and other elections. Earlier this week, I spoke to the directors of The Great Hack, Jahanu Jain and Kareem Amr, as well as propaganda researcher Emma Bryant and a former Cambridge Analytica whistleblower, Brittany Kaiser. I asked Kareem Amr to talk about what Cambridge Analytica effort to suppress the vote in Trinidad and Tobago did.
It was important for us to show in the film the expansiveness of Cambridge's work. This went beyond the borders of the United States and even beyond the borders of the EU and the UK, because what we find is that Cambridge used in pursuing this global influence industry that they were very much a part of. They used different countries as petri dishes to learn and get the know-how about different tactics. And from improving those tactics, they could then sell them for a higher margin in Western democracies where the election budgets are. We have to remember. I think it's important to predicate that the election business has become multi-billion-dollar global business, right? So we have to remember that while we are upset with companies like Cambridge, we allowed for the commoditization of our democratic process, right? So people are exploiting this now because it's become a business, and we, as purveyors of this, can't really be as upset as we want to be when we've justified that. So I want to preface it with that. Now, that being said, what's happened as a result is a company like Cambridge can practice tactics in a place like Trinidad that's very unregulated in terms of what they can and can't do, learn from that know-how, and then use it parlay it into activities in the United States. What they did in Trinidad, and why it was important for us to show it in the film, is they led something called the Do So campaign, where they admit to making it cool and popular among youth to get out and not vote. And they knew.
So you had the Indian population and the black
population. And there's a lot of historic tension between those two, and a lot of generational differences as well between those two. And the Do So campaign was done in a way to, by looking at the data and looking at the predictive analysis of which group would vote or not vote, get enough people to dissuade them from voting so that they could flip the election. Targeted at the youth. And so this is really when you
don't vote.
Yes, exactly. And
with their fists crossed. And that it became cool not to vote.
Exactly. And you look at the level of calculation behind this, and it's quite frightening. Now, as Emma was saying, a lot of these tactics were born out of our own fears. in the United States and the UK post 9/11, when we allowed for this massive weaponization of influence campaigns to begin. If you remember President Bush talking about, the battle for the hearts and minds of the Iraqi people, all of these kinds of industries were born out of this. And now I believe what we're seeing is the hens have come home to roost, right? All of these tactics that we developed in the name of, quote unquote, fighting the war on terror, in the name of doing these things, have now been commercialized and used to come back to the biggest election market in the world, the United States. And how do we blame people for doing that when we've allowed for our democracy to be for sale? And that's what Brittany's files today that she's releasing and has released over the past couple of days really give us insight to. The hindsight files that Brittany's released show us how there is an auction happening for influence campaigns in every democracy around the world. There is no vote that is unprotected in the current way that in the current space that we're living. And the thing that's allowing this to happen is these information platforms like Facebook. And that is what's so upsetting, because we can actually do something about that. We are the only country in the world that can hold Facebook accountable, yet we still have not done so. And we still keep going to their leadership hoping they do the right thing, but they have not. And why is that? Because no industry has ever shown in American history that it can regulate itself. There is a reason why antitrust laws exist in this country. There's a tradition of holding companies accountable, and we need to re-embrace that tradition, especially as we enter into 2020, where the stakes could not be higher.
Brittany Kaiser, can you talk about the Crooked Hillary campaign and how it developed?
Absolutely. So this started as a super PAC that was built for Ted Cruz, Keep the Promise One, which was run by Kellyanne Conway and funded by the Mercers. That was then converted to becoming a super PAC for Donald Trump. They tried to register with the Federal Election Commission the name Defeat Crooked Hillary, and the FEC luckily did not allow them to do that. So it was called Make America Number One. This super PAC was headed by David Bossie, someone that you might remember from Citizens United, who basically brought dark money into our politics and allowed endless amounts of money to be funneled into these types of vehicles so that we don't know where all of the money is coming from for these types of manipulative communications. And he was in charge of this campaign. Now, on that 2-day-long debrief that I talked about, and if you want to know more, you can read about it in my book, they told us...
Wait, and explain where you were and who was in the room.
So I was in New York in our boardroom for Cambridge Analytica's office on Fifth Avenue, and all of our offices from around the world had called in to videocast. And everybody from the super PAC and the Trump campaign took us through all of their tactics and strategies and implementation and what they had done. Now, when we got to this Defeat Crooked Hillary super PAC, they explained to us what they had done, which was to run experiments on psychographic groups to figure out what was working and what wasn't. Unfortunately, what they found out was the only very successful tactic was sending fear-based scaremongering messaging to people that were identified as being neurotic. And it was so successful in their first experiments that they spent the rest of the money from the super PAC over the rest of the campaign only on negative messaging and fear-mongering.
And Crooked, the OO in Crooked was handcuffs.
Yes, that was designed by Cambridge Analytica's team.
Kareem.
And one thing I think it's important to remember here, because there's been a lot of debate among some people about, well, did this actually work? To what degree did it work? How do we know whether it worked or not? What Brittany's describing is a debrief meeting where Cambridge as a company is saying, this is what we learned from our political experience, this is what actually worked, okay? And they're sharing it because they're saying, now this is how we want to codify this and commoditize this to go into commercial business, right? So this is the company admitting to their own know-how. There's no debate about whether it works or not. This is not them advertising it to the world. This is them saying, this is what we've learned. Based off that, this is how we're going to run our business. This is how we're going to invest in the expansion of this to sell this outside of politics. The game was take the political experience, parlay it into the commercial sector. That was the strategy. So there is no debate whether it worked or not. It was highly effective. And the thing that's terrifying is that while Cambridge has been disbanded, the same actors are out there. And nothing has changed to allow us to start putting in place legislation to say there's something called information crimes. In this era of information warfare, in this era of information economies, what is an information crime? What does it look like? Who determines it? And yet without that, we are still living in this unfiltered, unregulated space where places like Facebook are continuing to choose profit over the protection of the republic. And I think that's what's so outrageous.
And I think it's pretty telling that only two people have come forward from Cambridge Analytica. Why is that? Both of the people that have come forward, Brittany and Chris, and also with Carol's writing, have been targeted personally. And it's been a very, very difficult story to tell. Even with us, when we released the film in January, every single time we have entered into the country, we have been stopped for 4 to 6 hours of questioning at the border. Stopped by on the border of the U.S. in JFK Airport, where you're taken into the back, asked for all of your social media handles, questioned for 4 to 6 hours every single time we enter the country.
Since when?
Since we released the film, so since Sundance, since January. Every time we've come back into the U.S.
And on what grounds are they saying they're stopping you?
No explanation.
And what is your theory?
My theory is that it's got something to do with this film. Maybe we're doing something right. We've been stopped in Egypt, but we've never been stopped in the U.S. in this way. We're American citizens. Right? You
talk about people coming forward and not coming forward. I wanted to turn to former Cambridge Analytica COO, the Chief Operating Officer, Julian Wheatland, speaking on the podcast Recode Decode.
The company made some significant mistakes when it came to its use of data. They were ethical mistakes. And I think that part of the reason that happened was that we spent a lot of time concentrating on not making regulatory mistakes. And so for the most part, we didn't, as far as I can tell, make any regulatory mistakes, but we got almost distracted by ticking those boxes of fulfilling the regulatory requirements. And it felt like, well, once that was done, then we'd done what we needed to do, and we forgot to pause and think about ethically what was going on.
So if you could decode that, Brittany, Cambridge Analytica COO Julian Wheatland, who interestingly in The Great Hack, while he was really condemned Chris Wylie, did not appreciate Chris Wylie stepping forward and putting Cambridge Analytica in the crosshairs in the British Parliament. He was more equivocal about you. He talked about Wheatland and his role and what he's saying about actually abiding by the regulations, which they actually clearly didn't.
Once upon a time, I used to have a lot of respect for Julian Wheatland. I even thought we were friends. I thought we were building a billion-dollar company together that was going to allow me to do great things in the world. But unfortunately, that's a story that I told myself and a story he wanted me to believe that isn't true at all. While he likes to say that they spent a lot of time abiding by regulations, I would beg to differ. Cambridge Analytica did not even have a data protection officer until 2018, right before they shut down. I begged for one for many years. I begged for more time with our lawyers and was told I was creating too many invoices. And for a long time, because I had multiple law degrees, I was asked to write contracts, and so were other...
Didn't you write the Trump campaign contract?
The original one, yes, I did. And there were many other people that were trained in human rights law in the company that were asked to draft contracts, even though contract law was not anybody's specialty within the company. But they were trying to cut corners and save money, just like a lot of technology companies decide to do. They do not invest in making the ethical or legal decisions that will protect the people that are affected by these technologies.
I wanted to bring Emma Bryant back into this conversation. You mentioned it in part one of our discussion, this issue of military contractors and the nexus of military and government power, the fact that with Trump's election, military contractors were one of the greatest financial beneficiaries of Trump's election.
But I think it's important to
Absolutely.
remember
Karima.
that the issue is that also when we think of military contractors, we think of people selling tanks and guns and bullets and these types of things. The problem that we don't realize is that we're in an era of information warfare. So the new military contractors aren't selling the traditional tanks. They're selling.
Although they're doing that.
They're doing that as well, but they're selling the equivalent of that in the information space. And that's a new kind of weapon. That's a new kind of battle that we're not familiar with. And the reason why it's more challenging for us is because there's a deficit of language and a deficit of visuals. We don't know where the battlefield is. We don't know where the borders are. We can't point and be like, this is where the trenches are. Yet we're starting to uncover that. And that was so much of the challenge in making this film, is trying to see where can we actually show you where these wreckage sites are, where the casualties of this new information warfare are, and who the actors are and where the fronts are. And I think in entering 2020, we have to keep a keen eye on where the new war fronts are and when they're happening in our domestic trenches and how they're happening in these devices that we use every day. So this is where we have to have a new kind of reframing of what we're looking at, because while we are at war, it is a very different kind of borderless war where asymmetric information activity can affect us in ways that we never imagined.
And Emma Bryant, you talked about when Facebook knew the level of documentation that Cambridge Analytica was taking from them. I mean, Cambridge Analytica paid them, right?
Yes, I mean they were providing the data to GSR, who then were
explain what GSR is.
Paid by the company by Kogan and Joseph Chancellor, their company that they were setting up to do both academic research, but also to exploit the data for Cambridge Analytica's purposes. So they were working with on mapping that data onto the personality tests and giving that access to Cambridge Analytica so that they could scale it up to profile people across the target states in America especially, but also all across America. They obtained way more than they ever expected, as Chris Wiley and Brittany have shown. But I want to also ask, when did our governments know about what Cambridge Analytica and SCL were doing around the world, and when they were starting to work in our elections? One of the issues is that these technologies have been partly developed by, grants from our governments, and that these were, defense contractors, as we say. We have a responsibility for those companies and for ensuring that there's reporting back on what they're doing and some kind of transparency. As Karim was saying, that if you, we're in a state of global information warfare now. If you have a bomb that has been discovered that came from an American source and it's in Yemen, then we can look at that bomb, and often there's a label which declares that it's an American bomb that has been bought, that has been used against civilians. But what about data? How do we know if our militaries develop technologies and the data that it has gathered on people, for instance, across the Middle East, the kind of data that Snowden revealed? How do we know when that is turning up in Yemen, or when that is being utilized by an authoritarian regime against the human rights of its people, or against us? How do we know that it's not being manipulated by Russia, by Iran, by anybody who's an enemy, by Saudi Arabia, for example, who SCL were also working with? We have no way of knowing unless we open up this industry and hold these people properly accountable for what they're doing.
SCL Defense was the parent company of Cambridge Analytica. Emma Bryant, human rights researcher at Bard College, her upcoming book, Propaganda Machine, Inside Cambridge Analytica and the Digital Influence Industry. We'll be back in less than 30 seconds. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. As we continue our look at Cambridge Analytica, Facebook, and their roles in U.S. and other elections, I speak to the directors of the Great Hack, Jahan Najaim and Kareem Amer, as well as former Cambridge Analytica whistleblower Brittany Kaiser, who's begun posting online a trove of documents detailing the operations of the now-defunct company. I asked propaganda researcher Emma Bryant to talk about the significance of the documents.
I think the biggest reveal is going to be in the American campaigns around this, but I think you haven't seen the half of it yet. This is the tip of the iceberg, as I've been saying. My thing that I think that is most interesting of what's been revealed so far is actually the Iran campaign, because this is a very complex issue, and it really is an exemplar of the kinds of conflicts of interest that I'm talking about. A company that is set out to profit from the arms trade and from the expansion of war in that region, and from the favoring of one side in a regional conflict, essentially backed by American power, by the escalation of the conflict with Iran, and by getting more contracts, of course, with the Gulf states, the UAE and the Saudis. And of course they were trying to put Trump in power as well to do that, and advancing John Bolton and the other hawks who have been trying to demand that sanctions, to keep sanctions and to get out of the Iran deal, which they have been arguing is a flawed deal. And of course, SCL were involved in doing work in that region since 2013, including they were working before that on Iran for President Obama's administration, which I'm going to be talking more about in the future. The issue is that there is a conflict of interest here. So you gain experience for one government, and then you're going and working for others that maybe are not entirely aligned in their interests.
Although it was for the election of Donald Trump, of course, it happened during the Obama years. That's when Cambridge Analytica really gained its strength in working with Facebook.
Yep. And SCL's major shareholder, Vincent Cengiz, of course, was involved in the early establishment of the company Black Cube in some of its early funding, I believe. I don't know how long they stayed in any kind of relationship with that firm. However, the firm Black Cube were also targeting Obama administration officials with a massive smear campaign, has been revealed in the media. And, this opposition to the Iran deal and the promotion of these kinds of, really fear-mongering advertising that Brittany is talking about is very disturbing, when this same company is also driving, advertising for gun sales and things like that.
Wait, explain what Black Cube is, which goes right to today's headlines, because Harvey Weinstein, accused of raping I don't know how many women at last count, also employed Black Cube, former Israeli intelligence folks, to go after the women who were accusing him, and even to try to deceive the reporters, like at the New York Times, to try to get them to write false stories.
Absolutely. I mean, this is an intelligence firm that was born again out of the war on terror. So Israel's war on terror this time produced an awful lot of, people who had gone through conscription and developed really, strong expertise in cyber operations, or on developing information warfare technologies in general, intelligence gathering techniques. And Black Cube was formed by people who came out of the Israeli intelligence industries, and they all formed these companies, and this has become a huge industry, which is not really being properly regulated as well, and properly governed, and seems to be rather out of control. And they have been also linked to Cambridge Analytica in the evidence to Parliament. So I think the involvement of all of these companies is really disturbing as well in relation to the Iran deal. We don't know that Cambridge Analytica in any way were working with Black Cube at this point in time. However, the fact is that all of this infrastructure has been created, which is not being properly tackled, and how they're able to operate without anybody really understanding what's going on is a major, major problem.
Brittany,
Black Cube isn't the only company you should be concerned about. The founder of Blackwater, or their CEO, Eric Prince, was also an investor in Cambridge Analytica. So he profits from arms sales around the world and military contracts, and has been accused of causing the unnecessary deaths of civilians in very many different wartime situations. He was one of the investors in Cambridge Analytica and their new company, Emerdata. And so I should be very concerned, and everyone should be very concerned about the weaponization of our data by people that are actually experts in selling weapons. So that's one thing that I think needs to be in the public discussion, the difference between what is military, what is civilian, and how those things can be used for different purposes or not.
And I think what's important to see is that, as in the clip you showed, Chris Wiley's talking about how Cambridge is a full-service propaganda machine. What does that really mean? And, I would beg to say that what's happening is we're getting insight to the network of the influence industry, the buying and selling of information and of people's behavioral change. And it is a completely unregulated space. And what's very worrisome is this, as we're seeing more and more with what Emma's talking about and Brittany's shown, is this conveyor belt of military-grade information and research and expertise coming out of our defense work that's being paid for by our tax money, then going into the private sector and selling it to the highest bidder with different special interests from around the world. So what you see in the files is, a oil company buying influence campaign in a country that it's not from and having no responsibility or anything to what it's doing there, and what happens in the results of that research, where it gets handed over to, no one knows. Any contracts that then result in the change that happens on the political ground, no one tracks and sees. So this is what we're very concerned about, is because you're seeing that everything has become for sale. And if everything is for sale...
Our elections are for sale.
Exactly. And so how do we have any kind of integrity to the vote when we're living in such a condition?
Democracy has been broken, and our first vote is happening in 28 days, and nothing has changed. No election laws have changed. Facebook's a crime scene. No research, nothing has come out. We don't understand it yet. This was why we felt so passionate about making this film, because it's invisible. How do you make the invisible visible? And this is why Brittany is releasing these files, because unless we understand the tactics which are currently being used again right now as we speak, same people involved, then we can't change this.
Facebook's a crime scene. Jahan, elaborate on that.
Absolutely. Facebook is where this has happened. Initially, we thought this was Cambridge Analytica, right? And that Cambridge Analytica was the only bad player. But Facebook has allowed this to happen. And they have not revealed. They have the data. They understand what has happened, but they have not revealed that.
And they have profited off it.
And they have profited off it.
Well, it's not just that they've profited off it. I think what's even more worrisome is that a lot of our technology companies, I would say, are incentivized now by the polarization of the American people. The more polarized, the more you spend time on the platform checking the endless feed, the more you're hooked, the more you're glued, the more their KPI at the end of the year, which says number of hours spent per user on platform, goes up. And as long as that's the model, then everything is designed from the way you interact with these devices to the way your news is sorted and fed to you to keep you on as hooked as possible in this completely unregulated, unfiltered way, under the guise of freedom of speech, when it's selectively there for them to protect their interest further. And I think that's very worrisome, and we have to ask these technology companies: would there be a Silicon Valley if the ideals of the open society were not in place? Would Silicon Valley be this refuge for the world's engineers of the future to come reimagine what the future could look like had there not been the foundations of an open society? There would not be. Yet the same people who are profiting off of these ideals, protecting them, feel no responsibility in their preservation. And that is what is so upsetting. That is what is so criminal, and that is why we cannot look to them for leadership on how to get out of this. We have to look at the regulation. If Facebook was fined $50 billion instead of $5 billion, I guarantee you we wouldn't be having this conversation right now. It would have led to not only an incredible change within the company, but it would have been a signal to the entire industry. And there would have been innovation that would have been sponsored to come out of this problem. Like, we can use technology to fix this as well. We just have to create the right incentivization plan. I have belief that the engineers of the future that are around can help us get out of this. But currently, they are not the decision makers, because these companies are not democratic whatsoever.
Emma Bryant.
Could I? Yes, please. I just wanted to make a point about how important this is for ordinary Americans to understand the significance for their own lives as well. Because I think some people hear this and they think, oh, tech, this is maybe quite abstract, or, they may feel that other issues are more important when it comes to election time. But I want to make the point that actually, this subject is about all of those other issues. This is about inequality and it being enabled. If you care about, having a proper debate about all of the issues that are relevant to America right now, do you care about the horrifying state of American prison system, what's being done to migrants right now? If you care about a minimum wage, if you care about the healthcare system, you care about the poverty, the homelessness on the streets, you care about American prosperity, you care about the environment and making sure that your country doesn't turn into the environmental disaster that Australia is experiencing right now, then you have to care about this topic, because we can't have an adequate debate. We cannot know that we have a fair election system until we understand that we are actually having a discussion from American to American, from country to country, that isn't being dominated by rich oil industries or defense industries and brutal leaders and so on. So I think that the issue is that Americans need to understand that this is an underlying issue that is stopping them being able to have the kinds of policies that would create for them a better society. It's stopping their own ability to make change happen in the ways that they want it to happen.
Emma Bryant,
it's not an abstract issue.
What would be the most effective form of regulation? I mean, we saw old Standard Oil broken up, these monopolies broken up. Do you think that's the starting point for companies like Facebook, like Google, and others?
I think that's a big part of it. I do think that Elizabeth Warren's recommendations when it comes to that and antitrust and so on are really important. And we have legal precedents to follow on that kind of thing. But I also think that we need an independent regulator for the tech industry, and also a separate one for the influence industry. So America has some regulation when it comes to lobbying. In the UK, we have none. And quite often, American companies will partner with a British company in order to be able to get around doing things, for instance. We have to make sure that different countries' jurisdictions cannot be, abused in order to make something happen that would be forbidden in another country. We need to make sure that we're also tackling how the money is being channeled into these campaigns, because actually there's an awful lot we could do that isn't just about censoring or taking down content, but that actually is, about making sure that the, dark money isn't being funneled in to fund these actual campaigns. If we knew who was behind them, if we were able to show which companies were working on them and what other interests they might have, then I think this would really open up the system to better journalism, to better, more accountability. And the issue isn't just about what's happening on the platforms, although that is a big part of it. We have to think about, the whole infrastructure.
Propaganda researcher Emma Bryant, Johanna Jaim and Kareem Amr, the directors of The Great Hack, the Netflix documentary just shortlisted for an Academy Award, and Cambridge Analytica whistleblower Brittany Kaiser, author of Targeted, the Cambridge Analytica whistleblower's inside story of how big data, Trump, and Facebook broke democracy and how it can happen again. To see the first hour of our discussion, go to democracynow.org. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Nermeen Sheikh, Harla Wills, Tammy Warrenoff, Libby Rainey, Sam Alcoff, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen, Hani Massoud, Trina Ndurate, Marie Astudio, Adriana Contreras, and Maria Terracena. Special thanks to Julie Crosby. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining us.